Look closely at the shivering heat haze rising off the pavement at the border crossings in Windsor and Sarnia, because what you are seeing is not just the distortion of summer air, but the warping of a century-old alliance. A single pen stroke in a quiet office in Ottawa has just placed a loaded gun against the temple of the American industrial heartland. We were told the taps would always flow, and we were told that the friendship was as deep as the reservoirs of the Athabasca oil sands, but the mask of the polite neighbor has finally slipped to reveal the cold eyes of a strategic adversary. This is the moment the gears of the world's largest integrated economy began to grind with the screeching sound of metal on metal. The silence of a pipeline is the loudest sound in the world when it is your blood that stops moving. To understand how we arrived at this precipice of an energy war, we have to look back to the closed-door sessions of 3 months ago, when the rhetoric of trade protectionism first crossed the threshold of survival. While public officials stood at podiums offering platitudes about shared values and environmental cooperation, their strategists were already mapping out the vulnerabilities of the American Midwest, like generals eyeing a breach in a fortress wall. They saw our refineries in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio not as partners, but as hostages to a singular geographic reality. Canada provides over 4,000 barrels of oil per day to the United States, and they have finally realized that they do not need to fire a single shot to bring our economy to its knees. This did not happen by accident. It was a calculated retreat from a continental handshake that has lasted for generations. For decades, we assumed the flow was a law of nature as inevitable as the tides, but the tacticians in the North have been studying the blueprints of our dependence. They watched as we shuttered our own production, and they smiled as we became more reliant on their heavy crude to keep our specialized refineries operational. They knew that if they ever pulled the plug, the shockwaves would not just hit the stock market, but would ripple through every kitchen table in the country. The Inciting Incident was a series of failed negotiations over softwood lumber and automotive tariffs that the media barely covered, but the insiders knew the stakes were shifting from trade to survival. While the public was distracted by the theater of electoral politics, the institutional bodies in Ottawa were behaving like a living system, protecting its own interests by identifying the precise pressure points that would make Washington blink. They stopped talking about trade and they started talking about sovereignty with a sharpness that signaled a historic turning point. We are now seeing the documented evidence of this shift in real time. Internal memos from the Ministry of Natural Resources, now circulating among anonymous truth-tellers, reveal a deliberate pivot toward Asian markets. This is not just a commercial expansion, it is a strategic diversion. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion was sold as a way to diversify exports, but the leaked documents show it is being framed as a weapon of leverage. One senior strategist was quoted in a confidential briefing stating that if the Americans want to treat us like a colony, they can learn to refine our absence. The strategy is one of surgical precision. By redirecting the flow of Western Canadian Select away from the Gulf Coast and toward the Pacific terminals, they are creating a vacuum in the American supply chain. This is not a theory. We are looking at a planned 15% reduction in scheduled flows starting next fiscal quarter. When you remove that volume from the system, the price discovery mechanism goes into a terminal tailspin. It is an orchestrated scarcity designed to remind us who actually holds the keys to the engine room. Refineries in the Midwest are already beginning to signal the alarm. These massive industrial complexes are not just buildings, they are the iron lungs of our economy. They are tuned to process specific types of heavy Canadian crude, and you cannot just swap it out for lighter oil from West Texas overnight. If the Canadian supply drops, the refineries begin to choke. We are talking about potential equipment damage, operational shutdowns, and a total collapse of the regional energy balance. Imagine standing at a gas pump in a suburb of Detroit or Chicago, watching the numbers spin faster than your heart rate. You are not just paying for gasoline, you are paying the ransom for a failed foreign policy. The civilians are always the emotional anchors in these geopolitical games, and they are the ones who will feel the first sting of the betrayal. While the public officials hide behind technical jargon and regulatory excuses, the reality is that the cost of every gallon of milk and every delivery truck is being recalculated by a hostile strategy in a neighboring capital. The institutional bodies that were supposed to protect us are currently paralyzed. Our own strategists are calm tacticians who spent too long believing in the permanence of the status quo. They are reacting to a fire with a damp cloth while the antagonists are pouring gasoline. These antagonists are not labeled as enemies in our history books yet, but their behavior is indistinguishable from an act of economic aggression. They are using the infrastructure of our shared prosperity as a tool of extraction. We must break down the scenarios that are currently being modeled in the high-security war rooms of the energy sector. The probability framing is stark, and it offers no comfort to those who understand the mathematics of power. There is a 60% probability of what we call the managed squeeze. In this scenario, the supply is throttled just enough to create a permanent state of anxiety. The goal is to keep prices high and supply low enough to force the U.S. government to fold on every trade dispute currently on the table. In the managed squeeze, the flow is never fully stopped because the strategists in Ottawa still need the revenue. They are not suicidal, they are predatory. They want to drain the American consumer slowly while ensuring that their own treasury remains full. It is a parasitic relationship where the host is kept just alive enough to continue providing for the guest. This is the most likely outcome because it avoids a total diplomatic rupture while achieving every tactical objective. Then there is the 30% probability of a full diversion. This is the scenario where the Pacific pipelines are run at maximum capacity and the American Midwest is left with the scraps. This would occur if the Canadian government decides that its future lies entirely with the rising economies of the East. In this scenario, the refineries in Illinois and Ohio would be forced to source oil from the Middle East or South America at 3 times the cost. The logistics of this shift would take years to resolve, and during those years, the American heartland would suffer a depression that would make the Rust Belt look like a golden age. The final 10% is the dark horse of a total infrastructure shutdown. This would be framed as a response to an environmental emergency or a national security threat. We have already seen the precursors to this with the legal battles over Line 5 in Michigan. All it takes is one judge or one executive order to sever the artery. If that happens, the lights do not just dim, they go out. The probability is low, but the impact is existential. The consequences of these scenarios are not distant or abstract. They are immediate and they are devastating. 1. The immediate spike in diesel costs will paralyze the trucking industry, which means food will rot in the fields and store shelves will go bare within a week. 2. Midwestern refinery layoffs will begin within 60 days as the facilities become unprofitable to operate without the Canadian feedstock. 3. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve will be depleted at twice its current rate as the government tries to bridge the gap, but the reserve is a finite bucket in a desert. 4. Inflationary pressures will reset to levels not seen since the 1970s, destroying the middle class and erasing the savings of millions of families. This is the moral contrast between rhetoric and sacrifice. The public officials speak of the environment and the transition to green energy while they use the most carbon-intensive oil on the planet as a geopolitical bludgeon. They talk about the bond between our peoples while they calculate how many American jobs they can kill to gain a point of leverage in a trade deal. It is a grotesque display of hypocrisy that should ignite a fire of indignation in every citizen. We are witnessing the death of the continental handshake. We relied on the stability of a friend, and in our collective arrogance, we forgot that in the halls of power, there are no friends, only interests. The real power does not reside in the loud declarations of politicians, but in the quiet movement of molecules through a steel pipe. When that movement stops, the loud power becomes a hollow echo. We have been outmaneuvered by a neighbor we treated as an afterthought, and now the bill for that negligence is coming due. Think about the quiet podium moments before the big announcements. Think about the way the officials adjust their ties and clear their throats before they tell you that they are doing everything they can. They are lying. They are managing a decline that they helped facilitate by ignoring the warnings of the insiders who have been shouting into the wind for years. These anonymous truth-tellers have provided the receipts, and they have shown us the maps of our own vulnerability. The maps show a web of pipelines that all lead back to a single source of failure. We have allowed ourselves to be boxed into a corner where our national security is dependent on the goodwill of a foreign cabinet that no longer believes in the shared project of North America. They see a world that is fracturing, and they have decided to take their piece of the wreckage before anyone else can. This is the patriotic anxiety that keeps us awake at night, because we can see the storm coming and we know our roof is missing half its shingles. We must ask ourselves the pointed questions that the media refuses to pose. Can you truly call yourself a sovereign nation if your pulse is regulated by a valve in a neighbor's hand? What is the value of an alliance if it can be discarded the moment it becomes inconvenient? The strategists are betting that we are too weak and too divided to respond. They are betting that we will grumble about the prices and then simply pay them because we have no other choice. They are betting on our submission. This is the moral reckoning. We are at a historic turning point where we must decide if we are going to remain a hostage to energy blackmail or if we are going to take the radical steps necessary to secure our own future. The time for polite dialogue and diplomatic lunches is over. When someone points a gun at you, you do not ask them about their day. You find a way to take the gun away. The betrayal is not just in the action of our neighbor, but in the inaction of our own leaders. They watched this develop for a decade, and they did nothing. They let the Keystone XL pipeline die while the Trans Mountain pipeline lived. They let our own domestic production be strangled by red tape while the Canadians built the infrastructure to bypass us. This is a failure of vision that borders on the criminal. Look at the scrolling social feeds and you will see the confusion of a public that hasn't realized the trap has already been sprung. They see the rising prices and they blame the wrong people because they don't see the strategists in the quiet rooms. They don't see the confidential documents labeled as receipts. They only see the end result, which is a diminishing quality of life and a growing sense of foreboding. We are being told to stay calm and to trust the process, but the process is exactly what led us here. The process is a series of retreats and compromises that have left us exposed. We need to look at the military hardware silhouettes guarding the infrastructure and the stock market tickers reflecting the volatility and realize that this is a war by other means. It is a war of attrition, and we are currently losing. The escalating evidence is undeniable, and the probability of a crisis is nearing certainty. We are facing a future where the American industrial heartland could be turned into a ghost town, not by an invading army, but by a lack of fuel. The refineries are the heart, and if the heart stops, the body dies. This is not hyperbole. It is the physical reality of the industrial world we have built. How long will we allow our national security to be a bargaining chip? How long will we listen to the excuses of people who have never had to worry about the cost of a tank of gas? The call to engage is not just a request. It is a necessity for survival. We need a mobilization that matches the scale of the threat. We need to stop the bleeding, and we need to do it now. Tell me in the comments if you believe we should retaliate with the resources they depend on, or if we have already lost the leverage to fight back. Are you prepared to pay the price of this betrayal, or will you demand that our leaders finally put our security above their political convenience? This is the moment of truth. The heat haze at the border is not going away, and the gun is still held against our temple. The question is what we are going to do before the trigger is pulled. Stay tuned, because the next shift in the flow is coming, and it will be the most historic turning point of our lives.